Welcome back to the Sleepy Historian, your quiet little corner of the internet where boring history meets bedtime relaxation. If you're new here, this is a channel for soft-spoken history documentaries, calm bedtime storytelling, and people who find peace in drifting off to old stories, dusty facts, and gently whispered truths. You're in good company. Fans of Roman history, archaeology, and relaxing history to fall asleep to have all found their way here. So if you enjoy falling asleep to boring history, storytelling with ambient sounds, and tales told not for adrenaline, but for stillness, then you've found your place. And if this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, falling asleep to the same quiet rhythm of history. Now, let the lights dim. Let the fire crackle in the hearth. Let the chill of the modern world slip away, replaced by linen sheets, flickering candlelight, and the scent of lavender pillows warmed by sleeping heads. Tonight's story begins not with battle or a king's decree, but with a yawn. You see, the royalty of history, those kings, queens, princes, and princesses, were not immune to the very human need to rest. But how they did it, that's where the oddities begin. From hour-long prayers before bed, to superstition-fueled sleeping positions, to bedrooms packed with courtiers, physicians, and secret lovers, royal sleep was rarely quiet and rarely private. Tonight, we explore the strange sleep rituals of kings and queens, those late-night habits, dreamy routines, and midnight quirks that fill the halls of palaces from Versailles to Constantinople. We'll wander through their bedchambers with their creaking floorboards, perfumed pillows, and heavy velvet drapes. We'll visit monarchs who feared sleep and those who worshipped it. We'll explore ancient cures for royal insomnia, superstitions around sleepwalking, and how sleep became a performance for power and prestige. This isn't about royalty's public life. This is about what happened after dark, when the crown was set aside and sleep, strange and sacred, took hold. So lay back and close your eyes. We're not storming castles tonight. We're just listening for the sound of royal snores echoing through time. This is boring history for sleep. This is your history sleep story. This is the Sleepy Historian. Let's begin. As twilight settles over the palace, long shadows stretching across flagstone corridors, the world of royalty begins to change. The ceremonial bustle of the day slowly fades, replaced by a quieter rhythm. But unlike in common households, where sleep was a private matter dictated by exhaustion and moonlight, the journey to bed for a king or queen was an event of ritual, symbolism, and control. Imagine yourself in a castle at dusk. The last embers in the great hall's fireplace crackle softly. The warmth lingers faintly in the air, mingling with the scent of beeswax and wood smoke. Courtiers shuffle discreetly down side passages, their duties concluded for the day. In the royal apartments, a delicate silence builds. Velvet drapes are drawn. Servants scurry through hidden doors to lay out sleeping garments and warm bath water in copper basins. For royalty, the transition from day to night was choreographed. Everything had purpose. Everything had meaning. In Tudor England, Queen Elizabeth I's evening routine was as carefully curated as her court appearances. She did not simply slip into bed. First, her chambermaids would carefully help her out of the day's attire, a process that could take over an hour, layer by embroidered layer, with each piece of clothing folded, cataloged, and stored. Once undressed, she would be gently bathed, often with scented water, though full immersion baths were rare and reserved for necessity. Her bed was not only a place to rest, but a symbol of status. A Tudor royal bed might sit atop a platform and be surrounded by heavy curtains, not just for warmth, but to create a sense of sacred separation from the outside world. The bed was a throne for dreams. And then came the prayers. Monarchs were expected to end the day with piety. Long, whispered invocations would rise into the stillness, gratitude for survival, requests for guidance, and petitions for peaceful dreams. A book of hours, illuminated with golden leaf, might rest at the bedside. Faith, like sleep, was a nightly ritual. In Versailles, the French Sun King, Louis XIV, took things a step further. His couch or nightly ritual of going to bed was a public ceremony. Yes, public. Trusted courtiers were invited to attend as he undressed and got into bed. Attendance at this ritual was a sign of proximity to power. Imagine dozens of nobles quietly watching you prepare to sleep, all while maintaining rigid decorum and whispers of court gossip. Louis slept in a richly adorned bedchamber, under a canopy embroidered with gold thread. But the bed itself, lavish though it was often symbolic. He sometimes slept elsewhere in private, but the ritual of going to bed in front of witnesses was more important than the sleep that followed. Sleep was performance, even more so in ancient courts. In imperial China, the emperor's bedchamber was carefully guarded, not just for his safety, but for ritual purity. He did not choose when to sleep or with whom. Schedules were set by palace officials and astrologers. Sleep, it seemed, was a state governed by politics and stars. But not all was stiff ceremony. Some monarchs insisted on odd comforts before sleep. Catherine the Great of Russia reportedly couldn't fall asleep without her favorite dog curled up beside her. Emperor Nero was said to prefer a room filled with the scent of crushed roses, and Peter the Great enjoyed cold rooms with hard pillows, believing softness to be a weakness. Despite all the ritual, the core of royal sleep was this: it was never truly private. Guards stood outside doors. Servants waited within call. Lovers slipped in quietly. Physicians monitored breath and pulse. Sleep, for a monarch, was not an escape. It was a stage. And yet, there were still moments of quiet. The rustle of bed sheets, the hush of velvet against stone, the last glimmer of candlelight fading as the wick curled into darkness. In those moments, perhaps, kings and queens felt something familiar, that universal drift from wakefulness to dreaming, from power to surrender. Perhaps, despite the titles, they too were simply human, tired, hoping for rest. Imagine it's well past midnight in a great royal palace. The stone corridors are silent. Moonlight filters through stained glass, painting the floors in soft hues of blue and gold. A chill lingers in the air. But behind thick velvet curtains, a world still breathes. The bedchamber of a monarch is never truly still. The royal bed, while opulent, was rarely a private sanctuary. You might think of sleep as a moment of solitude. But for kings and queens, sleep was a delicate balance of security, ritual, and ever-watchful attendance. Let's begin with the sounds. In a medieval or Renaissance court, silence was never total. The slow crackle of the hearth, the shuffle of a night servant checking the coals, the creak of wooden beams overhead. Far off, bells might toll the hour. Outside, guards murmured at their posts, boots grinding against gravel. The royal world was never entirely asleep. Inside the chamber, at least one servant remained awake, sitting in the shadows, often a favored lady-in-waiting or a chamberlain. Their job was to observe and wait. Should the monarch wake in the night, needing water, warmth, or word of a dream, they were there, quiet, reliable, invisible. Now imagine the flicker of candlelight in the gloom, long after the rest of the palace has darkened. A queen might awaken and call for her night drink, a warming tonic of wine, honey, or spiced milk. In some courts, this was kept at her bedside in delicate porcelain vessels, sealed with wax to ward off tampering. Fear of poisoning was ever present. Night drinks were sometimes tested by servants, sometimes even blessed by priests. The sheets themselves were luxurious, fine linen or silk, changed daily. Beds were so large that a single person might seem lost in the space. They were designed not just for sleep, but for display. Monograms were embroidered onto pillowcases, family crests sewn into coverlets. But even in these soft surroundings, the monarch's rest was watched over carefully. There were guards at the door. Dogs or falcons, yes, falcons, sometimes slept at the foot of the bed. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, famously kept small dogs in her chambers. Louis XI of France allowed his hunting falcons to roost indoors, believing their presence protected him from evil spirits. Night visitors were not uncommon either. Trusted physicians might enter to check on the monarch's breathing or pulse. Dreams were recorded. In some cultures, dreams of kings were considered divine omens and could influence decisions at court. If the king tossed and turned or cried out in sleep, it might trigger worry across the palace. Some kings preferred to sleep apart from their queens, not for lack of affection, but to preserve ceremony. Yet others allowed favored consorts to stay, hidden by the heavy drapes. These unofficial companions were an open secret in many courts. Love, like sleep, was seldom straightforward. And then there were the secrets whispered in the dark. Courtiers might gain favor by slipping a note under the royal pillow, a gentle reminder, a plea for mercy, a bribe for land. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's concubines were carefully selected, and sleep arrangements were made in advance. Even slumber became a matter of strategy. The risk of assassination never left the royal mind. Some monarchs slept with a dagger under the pillow. Others insisted on changing chambers each night. Emperor Augustus Caesar reportedly moved beds nightly to avoid plots. In contrast, Charles V of Spain employed a personal sleep valet, a man whose entire job was to ensure the king's sleep was uninterrupted, protected, and precisely timed. And yet in the stillness, something universal remains. Even surrounded by ceremony and servants, even draped in gold-threaded blankets, kings and queens experience the same stirrings of dreams. The twitch of a foot, the whisper of a sigh, the soft murmur of a memory. And as the moon moved slowly across the sky, their breathing evened, slowed, and deepened. For just a few hours they drifted beyond crowns and politics, into a place where nothing mattered except rest. The sun has not yet risen, but the palace is already stirring. In a royal household, dawn was never silent. Long before the monarch opened their eyes, a quiet army of servants was already at work, stoking fires, preparing basins of warm water, laying out garments with trembling precision. The day began not with the sound of birdsong, but with footsteps in the corridors, the rustle of linen, the muted clang of polished metal. Imagine you are standing in the royal bedchamber. The heavy velvet drapes around the bed remain closed, holding in warmth and privacy. Outside, the castle courtyard is dim, lit only by the last pale stars. But within, a ritual is unfolding. In France, under Louis XIV, the king's lever or formal awakening was a public spectacle. The most favored nobles of the court were permitted to witness the monarch's rising, not simply to observe, but to participate. One noble might hand the king his robe. Another might present his slippers. A physician would offer a brief greeting, noting the monarch's health. A priest would deliver a short devotion. Every gesture had meaning. Every moment was symbolic. But before all that, there was the actual waking. Servants would enter quietly, drawing back curtains to let in light. A favored valet might gently call the king's name. Some monarchs prefer to be woken by music, a lute played softly or a chorus outside their window. Others insisted on silence until they were fully alert. Once awake, the monarch was not alone. The chamber filled quickly with attendants, grooms of the chamber, cupbearers, dressers, and spiritual advisors. The process of dressing took time. Underclothes, stockings, tunic, robes, sashes, jewelry. Each layer a statement, each gesture watched. For queens, the ritual was even more complex. Queen Elizabeth I was known to spend hours preparing for the day, not out of vanity, but because appearance was power. Her ladies-in-waiting worked with military precision, selecting gowns, arranging her hair, applying the famously pale makeup that became her signature. Mirrors were rare and mostly handheld. Instead, the queen trusted the eyes of her attendants. Breakfast, when taken, was modest by modern standards. A goblet of wine, some soft bread, a fruit if in season. Monarchs rarely ate heavily first thing. The stomach must be steady for the affairs of state. In Tudor England, the Lord Chamberlain would bring the king's secret papers, notes from the Privy Council, correspondence from ambassadors, reports from distant lands. Thus, before even setting foot outside the chamber, a king was already at work. But beyond these duties was something stranger, the belief that the way a monarch awoke could shape the entire day. If the king seemed irritable, courtiers whispered warnings down the halls. If he smiled at his servant, that servant might gain favor for weeks. A monarch's first moods were read like omens. And behind all of this, the ever-present sense of observation. The royal bedchamber was not a sanctuary. It was a stage. Even the smallest choices, which slippers to wear, which prayer to speak, were noted, repeated, remembered. A single nod during the lever could mean a promotion. A single frown could mean exile. Some monarchs grew to resent these rituals. Peter the Great of Russia, known for his disdain of pomp, often refused to be woken with ceremony. He preferred cold baths and simple clothes. But even he could not entirely escape the ritual, because the royal body was not just a person. It was a symbol. It belonged to history. And then, finally, the bedchamber would empty. The monarch, fully dressed, would step into the corridor. The day had begun. But perhaps, as they crossed the threshold, they cast one last glance at the rumpled sheets. The place of dreams, now behind them. A space of vulnerability, warmth, and fleeting solitude. The palace, of course, move on. Servants aired the room. Linen was changed. Perfumed waters were replaced. And the great bed waited, quiet and patient, for night to come again. Imagine yourself once again drifting into the heart of a palace. This time, it is Versailles, vast, echoing, and gleaming with gold. The year is 1700, and in the royal bedchamber, the King of France stirs beneath an embroidered canopy that soars nearly to the ceiling. This is not just any king. This is Louis XIV, the Sun King, and even in slumber, he is at the center of the realm. Louis XIV ruled for over 72 years, and every moment of his daily life was choreographed, recorded, and repeated like sacred liturgy. His sleep and his waking were no exception. The lever, or rising, was more than a morning routine. It was a daily political theater. Through it, the king reminded the nobles of his power, not with declarations or speeches, but with small, deliberate acts. The act of being seen, of being served, of being central. Picture the chamber still dim from the night, though flickers of candlelight shimmer in the mirrored walls. A hush falls over the assembled nobles as the Grand Chamberlain approaches the bed. Quietly, reverently, he speaks the words, "Sire, it is time." The king, practiced in this ritual since his youth, rises with slow elegance. The process begins with the first lever, attended only by the closest of his circle, the royal physicians, his confessor, and a few high-ranking courtiers. Here, the king is offered a silver bowl of water to cleanse his hands, a symbol of purity and preparedness. A short prayer is murmured, not rushed, not dramatic, calm, thoughtful, ritualistic. The grand lever follows. More nobles enter, dozens of them, not to speak, only to observe. The king, now seated on his chair, is dressed layer by layer. Silk underclothes, lace cuffs, velvet breeches, a satin waistcoat, jewels, and ribbons. Each item has a specific order, and each is handed by a designated noble. This is not vanity. It is control. In this ritual, Louis reminds every duke and count, I am the center of the world you live in. Your rank is shown by whether you hand me my gloves or merely observe from across the room. But before we go too far, let's step back into the night. Louis XIV slept in a ceremonial bed, tall, draped, and positioned against the wall facing east toward the rising sun. He believed himself divinely appointed, and every element of his life, including sleep, was meant to reflect that sacred connection. He did not sleep alone, not in terms of presence. The royal bedchamber included guards, pages, and occasionally his mistress or wife. He preferred a soft mattress, linen sheets warmed by bricks at the foot of the bed, and the gentle presence of a dog at his side. A candle remained lit throughout the night, the flamme royale, a symbolic flame of continuity. Louis also had peculiar habits. He often rose in the night to pray. His valet would accompany him to a private chapel or arrange a silent prayer within the chamber itself. He suffered from ailments, particularly painful dental issues, and often required hot compresses or warm drinks at odd hours. The servants remained vigilant. When he dreamed, they noted it. When he tossed in his sleep, it was considered noteworthy. Sleep for Louis was as public as it was personal. And yet, within this structured world, there was a rhythm. Night after night, day after day, the same steps unfolded. The bed was not just a place of rest. It was a stage. And when Louis finally drifted into slumber, he did so with the knowledge that tomorrow the dance would begin again. He once said, L'état, c'est moi. I am the state. Even his dreams belonged to France. As the sun slowly lifted above Versailles, gilding the windows with warm gold, the king was already halfway through his lever, the room filled with the scent of perfumes and powdered wigs. The courtiers whispered, the king stood, and the day, with all its duties, decorum, and diplomacy, began anew, all from the edge of a royal bed. Now, let us turn from the golden splendor of Versailles to a very different bedroom, or, in some cases, a battlefield tent. Imagine linen that smells not of lavender, but of dust and gunpowder. The flicker of candlelight replaced by the gray haze of dawn in a soldier's camp. Here, sleep was not a ritual. It was a tactic. Napoleon Bonaparte, general, emperor, strategist, and self-declared master Europe, had an utterly different approach to sleep. Where Louis XIV made sleep sacred and ceremonial, Napoleon made it useful. Weaponized, even, he was known for claiming he needed only 4 hours of sleep each night. He believed that the truly great, those born to command, had no time for the luxury of dreams. But this was not quite the full truth. What Napoleon practiced, more than anything, was polyphasic sleep. Small, intense bursts of rest, time between battles, meetings, or political briefings. He could sleep almost anywhere. In the saddle, at his desk, even standing against a wall with his arms crossed. His ability to fall asleep at what became legendary. His valet once recorded that the emperor would doze off the moment he stopped speaking, and awaken minutes later, refreshed and alert, with orders already forming in his mind. These naps might last 5 minutes or 50, but they were deep and immediate. No fuss, no preparation, just quiet and then action. At times, even during the heat of military campaigns, Napoleon would insist on silence in the command tent. He would lie down fully clothed, boots on, saber nearby, and shut his eyes. One aide-de-camp said it was as if the switch had been thrown. No tossing, no restlessness, just sleep like flipping a page. And when he awoke, the effect was equally swift. He might rise suddenly, shout a command, demand a map, or call for his generals. He was often sharpest after sleep, as if the act had not softened him but focused him. Yet for all his discipline, there were moments of vulnerability. On certain nights, particularly before major battles, Napoleon would reportedly walk in circles for hours. He would murmur to himself, hands clasped behind his back, eyes heavy but open. Was he thinking, praying, or resisting the one thing even emperors must eventually surrender to? Sleep, for Napoleon, was never an escape. It was a strategy, a tool, and in some ways it was his shield. His personal chambers, when he had them, were spare. No heavy drapes, no ornate canopies, just a bed, a table, and a simple military cot always nearby. Even as emperor, he preferred these austere arrangements. Ornate palaces bored him. He longed for the rhythms of camp life, for the simplicity of order and structure. But here's something curious. Despite his legendary efficiency, Napoleon valued sleep for others. He knew that a rested soldier was a better soldier. Before the Battle of Austerlitz, he told his officers to ensure the troops slept well. Fatigue is the enemy's ally, he warned. Let us not offer him aid. Even in exile, on the remote island of St. Helena, Napoleon maintained his habits. He would rise early, pace the garden, and nap at odd intervals. The rhythm of empire had left him, but his internal drumbeat continued. His bed was narrow. His dreams, if he spoke of them at all, were said to be filled with storms and ships, fields and fire. The world he conquered, revisited in flickers of slumber. Imagine him now, seated at a desk, candle burning low. His head nods once, twice, and then stillness. Sleep takes him, quickly and without ceremony. Somewhere, far from war and politics, the emperor is quiet at last. Now, let us walk through the torchlit corridors of Tudor England. The air is heavy with the scent of beeswax and baked meats. The great halls of Hampton Court echo with the fading footsteps of servants. In the royal chambers, thick velvet curtains hang like shadows, shutting out the wind, the moonlight, and perhaps the thoughts too loud to silence. Here sleeps, or attempts to sleep, Henry VIII, the most famously restless monarch in English history. Unlike Louis XIV, whose bed was a symbol of grandeur, or Napoleon, who turned slumber into a strategic weapon, Henry VIII had a complicated, often troubled relationship with rest. His nights, much like his reign, were filled with tension, desire, and disturbance. Imagine the king's bed, grand in size, carved from oak, and canopied with deep red drapery embroidered with gold thread. It stood in the middle of his private chamber, a room lined with tapestries that flickered in the candlelight. But even such comfort could not guarantee peace. Henry was a man of appetites, grand feasts, countless wives, endless ambition. And these habits followed him into the night. His weight, especially in later years, caused great discomfort. He suffered from leg ulcers, gout, and insomnia. A royal physician once noted that His Majesty would lie awake for hours, shifting and moaning as the pain visited his limbs. There was no sleeping in silence. His entourage often included body servants, doctors, and chaplains at the ready. At times, musicians were summoned to play the lute softly from the adjacent chamber. The melodies were light and repetitive, intended to lull the king rather than entertain him. A slow, calming rhythm. One might even say, boring. But what kept Henry awake was not just physical discomfort. It was also the weight of conscience. By the middle of his reign, he had broken from Rome, executed those once dear to him, and replaced queens as others might replace pillows. Some claimed he spoke in his sleep. Others swore they heard him weep. Still, rituals surrounded his bedtime. He often drank a warm posset, a mix of milk, ale, and spices, believed to soothe the belly. Lavender sachets were placed beneath his pillow. A fire crackled gently, never allowed to go out completely. Guards were posted at the door, always armed. always listening. When he did sleep, it came in snatches. Short intervals interrupted by pain or thoughts, or both. He would rise in the dark and pace. His slippers scraped across the stone floor as he muttered to himself, likely reciting scripture or political grievances. Sometimes he ordered scribes to be woken to dictate letters or amendments to decrees. At 3 or 4 in the morning, his queens, when he had them, slept in adjoining chambers. Only rarely did he share a bed, and when he did, it was not for the sake of warmth. His temper, famously unstable, worsened with lack of rest. Court officials walked on eggshells if they knew he'd had a poor night. The morning routine might shift entirely to accommodate his mood. Yet there is something profoundly human in all this. Despite the crowns, the swords, the silk-lined walls, Henry struggled as many of us do, with pain, with regret, with the noise of his own thoughts. In the small hours, even the most powerful man in England was just a man waiting for peace. One scribe noted, not unkindly, that His Majesty had the look of a man ever awake. Whether that was from ambition or torment, we may never know. But imagine him now, seated beside the hearth, rubbing his aching legs, eyes red from wakefulness. The lute plays gently in the background. A cup of warm posset rests at his side. For a moment, the king is still. And perhaps, just perhaps, he sleeps. Imagine a night thousands of years before electric lights, smartphones, or ticking clocks. The world outside your door is quiet. So quiet that you can hear the chirping of insects, the hush of the wind, and the gentle creak of your wooden roof. In the darkness, dreams weren't just idle wanderings of the mind. They were messages from the gods. In ancient civilizations like Rome and Egypt, sleep was not merely a biological need. It was a spiritual experience, often wrapped in mystery, mythology, and quiet rituals. Where we might take sleep for granted, these cultures built entire beliefs around the realm of dreams. Let us begin with the Romans. In Roman society, sleep was considered a vital part of a person's health, physical, mental, and even moral. Philosophers like Seneca and Pliny the Elder wrote about the importance of sleep hygiene. Fresh air, comfortable surroundings, and moderate food and drink. And yet, for all their practical advice, there was also a whisper of the supernatural. The Romans believed in the goddess Somnus, the personification of sleep. He was a gentle deity, often depicted with wings, a torch turned downward, and a calming expression. Somnus resided in a quiet cave where the sun never shone. The entrance was surrounded by poppies and herbs that induced sleep. It was said that even the sound of footsteps would be silenced at his gates. To sleep, then, was to visit the sacred realm. Briefly, Roman homes, especially among the elite, were arranged to honor rest. Bedchambers were tucked away from noise, and sleeping couches were often raised slightly above ground, covered in linen or wool, depending on the season. The wealthier Romans even had slaves called lectuarii, whose job was to prepare the bed each evening and fluff the pillows. But beyond the physical, there was the spiritual. Dreams. Dreams or somnia were taken seriously. Very seriously. If you dreamt of fire or water or flying, each image held meaning. There were dream interpreters, known as coniectors, who would be consulted the next morning, often before any other activity began. Even emperors listened to them. Julius Caesar was famously warned through a dream, not his own, but his wife Calpurnia's, about the Ides of March. She dreamed of his statue bleeding and the people washing their hands in it. The next day, she begged him not to attend the Senate. He went anyway. Now, let us shift across the desert sands to the land of the pharaohs. In ancient Egypt, sleep was even more tightly bound to the divine. The line between waking and dreaming was blurred, and temples often housed sleep chambers, where priests and supplicants would lie down and wait for divine visions. This sacred act was called dream incubation. Imagine lying on cool stone in a darkened temple chamber, incense swirling in the air, priests chanting softly. The goal? To receive a dream from the gods, perhaps from Thoth, the god of wisdom, or Serapis, a healing deity. These dreams were not interpreted as random. They were sacred, direct communications. Egyptians also believed that during sleep, the Ka, the life force or spirit, left the body temporarily and traveled, where one was uncertain, but was believed to visit the spirit world and return by morning. If the Ka could not return, death might follow. This belief shaped how they slept. Tomb paintings and preserved artifacts show that many Egyptians slept on headrests rather than pillows, a carved, crescent-shaped support for the neck that allowed the Ka to depart more easily. They slept on woven mats or low wooden platforms, often close to ground. Even their dreams were recorded on ostraca, pieces of pottery or stone, by scribes. There are preserved dream manuals that list symbols and their meanings. For example, if a man dreams of a crocodile, it means he will be devoured by his enemy. Comforting. But despite the spiritual gravity, sleep itself was sacred. Rest was a gift, a moment to leave the heat and toil of the day behind and return, briefly, to the realm of the gods. The Romans and Egyptians, separated by sea and time, shared this quiet reverence. For them, the night was not empty. It was full of visions, voices, and invisible pathways to realms beyond. And so, even in your own sleep tonight, perhaps some whisper of somnus or Thoth drifts by, quiet as a breeze through an open window. Imagine standing on a quiet hillside in the pre-dawn stillness. Mist clings low to the earth. Beneath your feet lies something older than writing, older than empires, a Neolithic tomb, carved into the stone long before kings or nations existed. To us, it may be a ruin, but to the people who built it, it was a place of sleep, eternal sleep perhaps, but also something more. Neolithic peoples, especially in regions like Britain, Ireland, and parts of Europe, believed in a cyclical understanding of time and life. Death was not the end. It was a transformation, a passage into another world, a world accessed through dreams, shadows, and the soil beneath. Many burial sites from this period, such as Newgrange in Ireland or Maeshowe in Orkney, were not only tombs, but ritual spaces, carefully constructed to align with celestial events. Newgrange, for instance, is aligned so that on the winter solstice, the rising sun sends a single shaft of light deep into the chamber, illuminating the dead for just a few minutes each year. To those early people, this was no accident. Light entering darkness, life visiting death, day dreaming into night. Inside these tombs, archaeologists have found bodies placed in curled positions, as if sleeping, heads resting on stones, arms folded as though cradling dreams. Grave goods, tools, beads, carved stones were placed nearby, not for decoration, but perhaps for use in the next life, or even in the dream world that bridged lives. There are even signs of ritual sleep. At Maeshowe, traces of soot and hearth fire suggest that people may have spent the night inside the tomb, not as a punishment or out of fear, but as a sacred rite, sleeping among ancestors to seek visions, insight, or communion. Imagine the stillness of that moment. Lying on cold earth, listening to the wind above, hoping that in your dreams you might receive wisdom from those who came before. Some scholars suggest this was a kind of initiation. Young people, perhaps, sleeping in the tomb as a rite of passage. Others propose that it was healers or shamans who entered the burial spaces, hoping to walk between worlds in their sleep. It is difficult to say exactly what they believed, but the care with which these tombs were built and the attention paid to their orientation with sun and moon suggests a profound connection between sleep, death, and knowledge. In some Neolithic cultures, like the Tripilia people of Eastern Europe, homes were ritually burned when they were abandoned, almost like the death of a body. Afterwards, People build a new structure on top of the ashes, as if allowing the old to dream beneath the new. Even the language of later peoples echoes this reverence. The ancient Greeks would refer to death as hypnos brother, and the Latin word for tomb, sepulchrum, comes from a root meaning to sleep. Our modern words of cemetery and rest in peace echo this old idea, that the dead are not gone but sleeping, perhaps still dreaming in the quiet of the earth. So imagine now, a young woman entering a Neolithic chamber, torch in hand, eyes wide with reverence. She lays herself down on the cold stone beside her grandmother's bones, wrapped in woven cloth. Her breath fogs in the dim space. The smoke from her fire curls toward the roof, and she dreams of what we will never know. But somewhere, etched in stone and darkness, those dreams remain. Sleep, for much of ancient history, was not a silent biological process. It was not a science. It was a realm, a place beyond the waking world, inhabited by spirits, gods, and whispering shadows. While today we speak of sleep cycles and melatonin, the ancients had a different vocabulary, one filled with deities that guided them into the dark and watched over their dreams. Some of you may have heard of Morpheus from Greek mythology, the shapeshifter who appeared in dreams, or Somnus, the Roman god of sleep we met earlier. But beyond these more familiar figures, in the quiet corners of mythology, we find lesser-known deities, forgotten ones, whispers in the dust. Let us begin with Hypnos, the Greek personification of sleep. He lived in a cave where neither the sun nor moon could enter, surrounded by poppies and night-blooming herbs. His river, the Lethe, flowed just outside, a river of forgetfulness. Those who slept under Hypnos' influence would awaken with memories softened, troubles dulled. Hypnos had 3 sons, the Oneiroi, each responsible for different types of dreams. Morpheus, who shaped dreams involving people. Phopter, who conjured dreams of animals and fearsome creatures. And Phantasos, mastered dreams involving nature and the inanimate. Imagine sleeping with these beings circling overhead. Your dreams shaped not by the mind alone, but by divine forces deciding what you would see. But let's step away from the Mediterranean for a while. In Mesopotamian mythology, we meet Nanshi, a goddess not only of water and prophecy, but of dreams. People came to her temples not just to pray or give offerings, but to sleep. It was believed that dreams received in the temple were more powerful, messages sent by gods through Nancha's blessing. And in the distant highlands of Peru, the Inca civilization worshipped Supi, a god of death and dreams. Though Supi later became feared under Christian influence, originally he was not evil. He was a guide, one who met souls in sleep and led them gently to the other side. To the Incas, dreams were another path to truth. Farther east in Japan, the Shinto tradition speaks softly of Baku, a spirit creature said to devour nightmares. Baku was not a god in the strictest sense, but benevolent beings summoned by children and adults alike. After a bad dream, one might whisper, "Baku, come eat my dream." The Baku would come silently and remove it, leaving only peace behind. A similar tradition existed in China, where the god Jinnu, associated with the stars and dreams, was said to guide lovers through the dreamscape. Dreams weren't random. They were threaded, woven like fabric between souls. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine you live in a world where the gods of your ancestors aren't far off or fearsome, but sleeping just beneath your pillow, stirring quietly in the candlelight of your dreams. They appear in stories, in rituals, in the way your grandmother ties her bed curtains shut at night. You whisper their names before sleep, not from fear, but from comfort. Even in the Norse world, harsh and cold, there was not the personification of night itself, a quiet, dark-robed goddess who rode across the sky in a chariot drawn by a horse named Rimfaxi, whose frothy mouth brought dew to the earth each morning. Not wasn't feared. She was respected. Each nightfall was a visit from her shadow. The belief in sleep deities was a way of understanding mystery, of making peace with the unknown world that unfolded when eyes closed. People didn't ask, "What is REM?" They asked, "What message will I receive tonight?" Or, "Which God is sending this vision?" And though those names have mostly faded, buried beneath modern explanations, there's something enduring about them, something still flickering at the edge of awareness. So tonight, if your dreams feel especially vivid, if you sense a presence near the edge of consciousness, perhaps it's Morpheus or Nancy or even a hungry Baku, curling around your pillow, listening for a nightmare to eat. And if the dreams come quietly and stay a while, remember that once long ago, people built temples for such things. People lit fires and left offerings, all for sleep. Imagine, for a moment, stepping into a royal bedchamber, not today, but in the 1500s. Perhaps you're in the court of King Henry VIII, or nestled deep in the marble corridors of Versailles. The heavy door creaks open. The air is perfumed, still and oddly cold. And there, rising like an altar, stands a royal bed. Not merely a place to sleep, but a symbol. To modern eyes, it might seem overly grand, even theatrical, draped in crimson or deep blue velvet. The posts carved with twisted lions or mythical beasts. The canopy, called a tester, floats above, embroidered with gold thread. And at the head of the bed, often a royal crest, watching silently over the monarch's rest. But this was not a sanctuary of privacy. In fact, quite the opposite. In many European courts, royalty did not sleep alone, nor did they always sleep in silence. Attendants came and went. Nobles might be allowed, as a sign of favor, to stand silently as the monarch was undressed for bed. This ritual was known in France as the coucher, and in England as the king's lever and coucher ceremonies. Not just for routine, but for politics. Imagine drifting to sleep knowing your enemies and allies might be watching. The bed became a throne by another name. Sometimes, royal couples did not share a bed at all. It was common, especially in later centuries, for kings and queens to have separate bedrooms, even in loving marriages. This was partly for decorum, partly for practicality. Privacy was scarce, and the royal day often began at the moment of waking. Servants would enter with food, letters, or petitions. The structure of these rooms varied. At Versailles, the king's bed was elevated on platform, symbolically placing him above all others. A gilded railing separated the bed from the rest of the chamber, marking the boundary between subject and sovereign. Even while asleep, royal beds were also moved often. When a monarch traveled, even just from one palace to another, their bed came with them. Not just a mattress, but the entire structure dismantled and packed. Why? Because the royal bed was a stage, an essential backdrop for ritual, influence, and spectacle. Even death, for royalty, often occurred publicly, in bed, but surrounded by advisors, clergy, and courtiers. The famous phrase, "the king is dead," "long live the king," was often spoken at the bedside, the moment one monarch passed and another rose. A bed is both cradle and throne. Yet for all this pomp, these beds were often surprisingly small. A modern sleeper might find them cramped. Why? Partly because people often slept propped up rather than flat, believing it was healthier. And partly because warmth was a greater concern than space. Curtains were drawn tightly around the bed to trap heat, important in drafty stone palaces. Some beds even had warming pans. Metal dishes filled with hot coals swirled between the sheets before the monarch entered. A servant would perform this task carefully, lest the bed catch fire. Another servant might ensure the linen was freshly scented with lavender or rosemary. But despite all of this, royalty did not always sleep well. Political intrigue, health concerns, and the constant churn of public life made restful sleep elusive. Diaries and letters often describe kings and queens waking frequently, or rising before dawn with anxious thoughts. Queen Elizabeth I, for example, was said to have suffered from long bouts of wakefulness during times of political tension. And then there were dreams. We don't always know what kings and queens dreamed, but from what little survives, it seems dreams were taken seriously, sometimes as omens, sometimes as burdens. Catherine de' Medici once refused to leave her chambers for days after a disturbing vision. Napoleon Bonaparte had recurring nightmares of being buried alive. Even behind silk curtains and gold-threaded pillows, the human need for sleep and the restlessness that can come with it remained. And so, beneath all the pomp and velvet, royalty lay much like everyone else, in need of rest, haunted by worry, comforted by routine, drifting at last into sleep. Throughout history, dreams have been seen as messages from the gods, from the dead, or from the recesses of the soul. But when a king or a queen dreamed, it wasn't merely personal. It was political. A monarch's dream could inspire fear, spark hope, or even change the course of history. Royal dreams carried weight. They were often recorded, interpreted, or even staged. Because behind closed doors, even in sleep, rulers were never truly alone. Let us begin with King Nebuchadnezzar II, ruler of Babylon. According to the book of Daniel, he dreamed of a towering statue made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay. He could not sleep for days afterward. The prophet Daniel interpreted the dream as a vision of coming kingdoms, his own and those to follow. Imagine the weight of that, lying in bed beneath stars carved into a palace ceiling, believing your dreams foretold empires. Centuries later, Constantine the Great, Emperor of Rome, claimed to have dreamed a shining cross before a decisive battle. In this sign conquer, the vision said. He awoke and ordered the Christian symbol painted on the shields of his men. They won, and he converted to Christianity, forever altering the faith's role in world history. But dreams weren't always welcome. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France and feared political figure, kept astrologers and dream interpreters close. In one letter, she speaks of a dream filled with blood and bells, interpreted as an omen of political betrayal. She canceled appearances. Some said it was superstition. Others believed she was simply listening to what the night revealed. And then there was Napoleon Bonaparte, who reportedly had recurring nightmares, not battle, but of being buried alive. He feared premature death and the idea of entrapment. His sleep was often restless, interrupted by sudden starts. A general by day and by night, a haunted man. Dream interpretation for monarchs was both a ritual and a risk. In Tudor England, it was dangerous to report troubling dreams, especially if they involved the monarch. To say you dreamed of the king's death could be seen as treason. So dreams were often whispered, wrapped in metaphor, or left unsaid. Still, many rulers consulted court mystics, priests, or physicians to interpret their sleep. A dream of water could mean betrayal. A white horse might mean victory. A snake could signify lies slithering in court. Sometimes elaborate books were kept, dream diaries for kings, pages filled with scribbled meanings and celestial charts. In China, emperors kept entire staffs of dream readers, whose job was to chart the ruler's visions. If the emperor dreamed of a dragon, it might signify divine favor or dangerous ambition. These interpretations could sway decisions, appointments, even war. Queen Elizabeth I was said to have dreamt of losing her crown before the Spanish Armada. When she awoke, she dressed in armor and addressed her troops with the famous line, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Whether the dream truly happened or whether it was made into a legend later, we may never know. Dreams in royal chambers were more than sleep. They were secrets. sometimes feared, sometimes fabricated, and still, the act of dreaming held universal truth. No matter the crown or the crest above one's bed, the experience of slipping into the unconscious, of seeing, hearing, or feeling something beyond the reach of logic was the same. Rulers, like peasants, closed their eyes and stepped into night's quiet labyrinth. Tonight, you might dream something strange, something vivid. But unlike ancient monarchs, you won't need to report to an astrologer or defend it to your counsel. You'll simply drift through a world of your own making. Let that thought settle like silk across your thoughts. Let it carry you. When a king or queen took to bed for the final time, it was not only the end of life, it was the beginning of a meticulously orchestrated ritual. In the medieval and early modern world, death was a public affair, especially for the elite. There was no slipping quietly away. Even the final breath was surrounded by ceremony, witnesses, and meaning. Imagine a royal bedchamber lit only by tall wax candles. The walls are draped in black cloth. Courtiers stand at a distance, their eyes lowered. A physician leans in to check the breath. A priest murmurs prayers in Latin. Somewhere outside, bells begin to toll. In those moments, often drawn out over days, the monarch was already beginning to transform from a person into a legend. In France, this ritual was known as a lit de justice or bed of justice. As the king lay dying, courtiers gathered not only to witness his final moments, but to confirm the transfer of power. This was no ordinary passing. It marked the end of a reign and the rise of another. The phrase "Le roi est mort," "Vive le roi," "The king is dead," "Long live the king," was often declared in the very same breath, spoken beside the bed, with one monarch's last exhale and the next formal beginning. The dying monarch was often dressed in robes of state. Even as they weakened, their head might be propped on silk cushions, their hands placed around a crucifix or prayer beads. For some, it was a quiet process, drawn out by illness. For others, it was sudden, prompting a flurry of messengers, announcements, and preparation for state mourning. And then came the transformation. Almost immediately after death, the monarch's body would be prepared not only for burial, but for display. This might involve embalming, though early techniques were limited and not always successful. Perfumed oils and herbs were placed around the body to mask natural processes. In colder regions, the bedchamber was chilled with ice or open to the night air. A life-size effigy was often created, a wax figure dressed in royal clothing, with glass eyes and human hair. This figure would lie in state while the real body was moved, sometimes in secret, to its final resting place. The effigy symbolized continuity, suggesting that even in death, the monarch's presence endured. In England, the death watch was a key part of this ritual. Selected members of the royal household would remain in the bedchamber in shifts, watching over the body for days, not for fear of foul play, but as a sign of respect, to ensure that the monarch was never alone. Funerals themselves could stretch for weeks. The body, often in a gilded coffin, would lie in a chapel surrounded by burning candles. Prayers were read continuously. Nobles came to kneel and pay homage. A thick veil of incense clouded the air, mingling with the smell of wax, wood, and damp stone. And when the final procession began, through cobbled streets lined with mourners, bells tolled for hours. Black horses pulled the hearse. Royal banners hung at half-mast. The people gathered in silence. The burial site was chosen with care. In France, the kings of old were laid to rest in St. Denis Basilica. In England, Westminster Abbey became the final resting place for many. Some monarchs chose elaborate tombs, others more modest markers. But no matter the monument, the bed where they died remained sacred. It was often dismantled, destroyed, or sealed. Some believed the bed carried the monarch's spirit. Others feared it carried the omen of death. And yet, In all these rituals and the whispers, the incense, the candlelight, there was one unspoken truth, that even kings and queens beneath velvet and gold came at last to the same stillness. A stillness not unlike the one you now feel creeping gently over your thoughts. The hush of a room, the rhythm of breath, the long silence after ceremony. In the end, whether in a peasant's cot or a gilded bed, sleep comes for all, and perhaps that is its own kind of peace. And so we come to the end of our quiet passage through royal bedchambers, whispered dreams, and the flickering final moments of monarchs long gone. You wandered tonight to the veiled world of kings and queens, not in battles or glory, but in their most vulnerable, most human hours, in dim candlelight, in the hush of velvet-draped rooms, in the weight of dreams that stir behind closed eyelids. From the intricate rituals of nightly sleep to the strange symbolism of dreams, from chamber gossip to final breaths and grand funerals, you've now seen that even power, in all its splendor, must bow before the simple rhythm of sleep. And perhaps there is some comfort in that no matter how golden the crown, how vast the empire, the act of resting one's head on a pillow at the end of the day is shared across time and class. Sleep is a great equalizer, soft, steady, and sure. Here on Sleepy Historian, we tell these stories not with urgency, but with calm. Not to shock, but to soothe. We offer boring history for sleep, a slow and steady journey through time's quiet corners, filled with soft-spoken history documentaries, bedtime relaxation, and the quiet rhythm of falling asleep to boring stories. Perhaps tonight's tale has helped you drift, or at least soften the edges of your busy day. If this kind of storytelling brings you a sense of peace, we gently invite you to support this space. Candle like this video if it's helped you rest. Candle subscribe to Sleepy Historian, but only if these stories bring you comfort. Candle and let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there falling asleep to the same old stories. We're a quiet little corner of YouTube, a candle in a window, a slow walk through history's forgotten hallways. So for now, rest easy. Let the past slip like mist through your thoughts. Let the rhythm of long-forgotten lives lull you into stillness. Let your breath fall into the same gentle pattern as those who lived, dreamed, and slept centuries before you. They are gone and we remain. But for this moment, in the hush of night, we meet them in the stillness. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and until next time, good night.